Daniel Livinus opened the door of La Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant, with the confidence of a man who had spent years as one of the most successful CEOs in the financial sector. He adjusted the Rolex on his wrist as he held the door for Chloe Jacob, his new girlfriend. Chloe, a model frequently gracing magazine covers, entered with the same air of superiority Daniel had come to both admire and tolerate. The ambience was dazzling as always. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their light reflecting softly across the impeccably set tables. The aroma of truffle butter and French wine lingered in the air. It was a setting designed to impress, and Daniel always chose settings like this. "It's perfect," Chloe murmured, sliding her delicate fingers along Daniel's arm. She looked stunning in a red dress that seemed sculpted to her body. He smiled, not out of any genuine feeling, but because it was what was expected of him. Her presence at his side was just another piece of the puzzle that made up his public image. They were led to a central table, strategically positioned to be noticed, but not excessively exposed. Chloe began talking about next week's charity gala, something about raising funds for an environmental cause. Daniel wasn't paying attention. It wasn't because he didn't care. Something in his peripheral vision had caught his attention. A waitress moved swiftly across the room, balancing a tray loaded with elegant dishes. Daniel froze. He recognized that face, the deep brown eyes, the soft features, unmistakable even from a distance. Sandra Philips, his ex-wife. But it wasn't just the shock of seeing her in a place he frequented so often that unsettled him. It was her condition. Beneath the black apron of her uniform, her noticeably swollen belly showed that she was pregnant. Very pregnant. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned, but his expression remained controlled. Chloe, busy adjusting the menu in front of her, didn't notice the sudden shift in his demeanor. "Daniel?" Chloe's voice carried a note of irritation. He tore his gaze away from Sandra just in time to avoid suspicion. "Sorry, what did you say?" he asked, feigning attention. "I was saying the Vogue photographer wants to do a couple's shoot with us. Brilliant idea, don't you think?" He nodded automatically, though her words barely registered. While Chloe kept talking, he stole quick glances at Sandra. She looked different from the woman he once knew. There was something about her posture, weary yet resilient, that remembered her as quiet and reserved, almost invisible amidst his life of meetings, business dinners, and international trips. And now there she was, just a few feet away, carrying a child. He needed answers. When Sandra returned from the back of the restaurant with a bottle of wine for another table, she finally saw him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the impact was like an electric shock. She nearly dropped the bottle, but quickly recovered, turning toward the table she was serving, her head held high. "I'm going to the restroom," he muttered to Chloe, who didn't even look up. Sandra was heading to the opposite side of the restaurant when Daniel intercepted her, stepping directly into her path. She stopped abruptly, the tray in her hands almost slipping. "Sandra," he said, his voice low but tense. She stared at him, her brown eyes darkening with a mix of surprise and caution. "Mr. Livinus," she replied formally, her tone neutral. "Don't treat me like a stranger," he shot back, his gaze dropping pointedly to her belly. "Is that what I think it is?" Sandra straightened her shoulders, gripping the tray firmly in her hands. "I don't know what you think." "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "You're pregnant. Why am I finding out about this now?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a rehearsed response. "My current condition has nothing to do with you," she said evenly. "This is absurd," he replied, struggling to keep his anger in check. "If this baby is mine, I have a right to know." Sandra met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't a conversation we should be having here," she said, her voice quieter now. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Daniel returned to the table, but his mind was miles away. Chloe was now busy taking selfies, seemingly content to ignore his mood. But Daniel couldn't ignore it. Sandra was pregnant, and he needed to know whose baby it was, and why she had kept it from him. Later that night, the sound of footsteps echoed in the silence of Daniel Livinus's penthouse apartment. He stood by the window, staring out at Manhattan's glowing skyline. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of confusion and frustration. He couldn't shake the image of Sandra's face or the sight of her swollen belly. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. Though his thoughts were far from the view, Daniel Livinus stood at the window of his penthouse, holding a glass of whiskey in his hand. The ice clinked softly as he swirled it. The image of Sandra Philips, pregnant and working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant, wouldn't leave his mind. She had vanished from his life 5 months ago. Sandra had always been practical, even when ending their marriage. There had been no shouting matches or heated arguments, just a cold, sharp silence as she signed the divorce papers and walked out the door. At the time, Daniel thought it was exactly what he wanted, freedom to focus on his career, free of distractions or emotional attachments. But now he wasn't so sure. He turned his phone over in his hand, hesitating for a moment before searching for Sandra's number. He knew he still had it. He had never deleted it. Pressing call, he listened as the line rang several times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He hated being ignored, but Sandra always had a way of throwing him off balance. Meanwhile, Sandra sat in her small apartment in Queens, exhausted after her shift. She sank carefully onto the couch, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The baby kicked and she smiled, a small, genuine gesture, before closing her eyes and letting out a long sigh. Seeing Daniel that night had been a shock, but she had known it would happen eventually. He was a man who always had control, who never let anything slip through his fingers. Seeing the surprise and confusion on his face when he noticed her pregnancy had almost made her laugh. Almost. But the pain was still too raw, the hurt too deep. She thought back to how things had fallen apart between them. Daniel had been consumed by his career, every second of his life devoted to expanding Livinus Capital. At first, she had admired his ambition, but over time she realized she would always come second, or maybe she was never truly part of his priorities at all. One night still haunted her. They were having dinner at home, a rare moment together, and she casually brought up the idea of having children. Daniel froze, his fork hovering mid-air. He looked at her, his eyes skeptical. "Children, Sandra? You know how destructive that would be for us right now. My time is completely consumed, and you know Livinus Capital demands all of my focus." She never mentioned it again. The idea of having children with Daniel felt as impossible as trying to change the course of a river with her bare hands. So when she found out she was pregnant, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. Their marriage was already hanging by a thread, and she knew Daniel wouldn't see the pregnancy as a blessing, only a complication. Instead of telling him, she made the hardest decision of her life, to leave. Her phone buzzed beside her, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. The name Daniel Livinus glared back at her. Her heart pounded, but she let it ring out, squeezing her eyes shut as if that could block out the storm of emotions he still stirred in her. The next day, Daniel strode into his office with his usual decisive gait, but his mind was anything but composed. He walked right past his assistant, Megan, who tried to get his attention. "Mr. Livinus, about today's agenda." "Not now, Megan," he muttered, heading straight to his desk. He opened his laptop and began searching. It didn't take long to find the basics. Sandra's address in Queens, the name of the restaurant where she worked, but something else stopped him cold. A file detailing the terms of their divorce revealed something he had overlooked. Sandra hadn't asked for a single thing. No part of his fortune, no financial support, nothing. He remembered her words the day they signed the papers. "I just want to move on, Daniel." At the time, he had felt relieved, but now it didn't make sense. Why hadn't she asked for anything? And why was she so determined to keep him out of her life? That evening, Daniel made a decision. He had to confront her. He showed up at the restaurant near closing time, taking a seat at a table in the back. The place was quieting down, and when Sandra saw him, her heart raced. She clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. She knew she couldn't avoid him forever. Finally, she walked over, her tone clipped. "Daniel, I'm working." His eyes, intense and unwavering, locked onto hers. "Can we talk now?" he asked bluntly. "I told you I'm working." "I'll wait," he said, crossing his arms. "I'm not leaving without answers." Her jaw tightened, and after a long pause, she sighed. "Fine." When the restaurant finally closed, Sandra stepped outside. The night air was cool, the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Daniel was already there, leaning against a lamppost. She walked up to him, arms crossed over her chest. "What do you want, Daniel?" He took a deep breath, his voice softer now. "I want to know why you didn't tell me." "Why would I?" She shot back. "So you could call it a complication? So you could remind me how inconvenient a baby would be for your career?" He flinched at her words. "That's not fair." She shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "You made it clear, Daniel. You had no room for a family. I did what I thought was best." He stared at her for a long moment, guilt and regret etched on his face. "Sandra, I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was losing." Her voice cracked. "Well, now you do." For a moment, the silence between them was heavier than words. Finally, she turned away, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I need to go." He didn't stop her. He watched her walk away, the weight of what he had lost sinking in. Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, their conversation playing on repeat. Each word she'd said gnawed at his conscience, pulling apart the carefully built walls around his heart. Was he really so incapable of being a father? Children were something he'd always planned for the distant future, once everything was perfect. But that future never arrived, and now reality was slapping him in the face. He got out of bed and went to his office, his sanctuary for clarity. Opening his laptop, he started searching for family law attorneys. He didn't know how to navigate this, but he was certain of one thing. He wanted to be part of the baby's life, whether Sandra liked it or not.
At the restaurant,
Sandra was finishing another grueling shift. Since her confrontation with Daniel, she felt a constant weight on her shoulders. James, the restaurant manager, noticed her tension as they cleaned up. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Sandra hesitated before replying. "I'm fine, just dealing with some things." James nodded, his concern clear. "If you ever need help, you know you can count on me." She offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you, James. You already do more than enough." Unlike Daniel, James was patient, empathetic, and understanding. He didn't know the details of her past, but he sensed she was healing from old wounds. He knew better than to push for trust, but he remained a steady presence. Daniel started coming to the restaurant more often, always sitting at a discreet table, his gaze never leaving Sandra. It was infuriating and exhausting. James watched his movements, quiet suspicion etched on his face. One evening, Daniel called her over after the dinner rush. "I don't want to keep doing this," he said, his voice low and determined. "I want to be part of this." Sandra scoffed, arms crossed. "Part of this? You don't even know what that means, Daniel. What you want is control, like always." He took a deep breath, fighting his frustration. "I can learn, Sandra, I want to learn, but you have to let me." She studied him for a long moment before saying, "Learning isn't enough. This isn't something you can control or delegate. Being a parent takes more than that." Before he could respond, James appeared beside them. "Everything okay here?" he asked calmly, his protectiveness clear. "It's fine, James," Sandra said quickly. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" James didn't flinch. "I'm the manager, making sure Sandra isn't being bothered." Daniel stood up, his stance defensive. "I'm not bothering her." James's gaze was steady. "Maybe you should let her decide that." The tension crackled, but Sandra stepped between them. "Stop it, both of you." She turned to Daniel, her voice low. "You want to be part of this? Prove it. But don't think you can just show up and expect everything to fall into place." She walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, James watching him closely. For once, Daniel didn't know what to say. Daniel hesitated, his jaw tight, but finally grabbed his coat and left the restaurant. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Who was James to Sandra? Was there something between them? The thought irritated him more than he wanted to admit. A few days later, the situation took an unexpected turn. Daniel hired a private investigator to learn more about Sandra. What he uncovered left him stunned. She had turned down a high-paying job offer at a local company because she didn't want any ties to him. She was saving every penny to ensure the baby's future, even if it meant working long, grueling shifts. But the most shocking revelation came at the end of the report. Daniel discovered that Sandra had visited a fertility specialist a year before their divorce. She had been trying to get pregnant while they were still married. The information shook him. She had wanted a child during their marriage. That contradicted everything he had believed. Daniel realized with a sinking feeling that he had never truly asked what Sandra wanted in life. He had simply assumed she wanted what he did. He needed to confront her again, but this time, armed with the truth. Sandra was walking home on a cold night when Daniel intercepted her at the entrance of her building. "I know about the fertility specialist," he said bluntly, his words slicing through the air like a blade. She froze, her heart racing. "You had no right to investigate my life." "I had every right," he countered. "Why didn't you tell me? Were you trying to have a child while we were still married?" Sandra took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I wanted a child, Daniel. I wanted a family. But you made it very clear that it wasn't part of your plan. And yet here you are pregnant," he said, bitterness lacing his voice. "You made that decision for both of us." "No," she shot back, her voice steady. "I made that decision for myself and for this child, because I knew you would never understand." Daniel was momentarily at a loss for words. For the first time, he began to see the depth of the pain and loneliness Sandra had endured during their marriage. But that didn't diminish the anger brewing within him, not just at her, but at himself. "I want to be a part of this," he finally said, his tone firm, "and I'm not giving up until you let me." Sandra stared at him, exhaustion and determination etched into her face. "Then maybe you should start by learning what it really means to be present, Daniel, because words aren't enough." She turned and walked into the building, leaving him standing alone once again. But this time, something inside him had shifted. The icy Manhattan wind howled that night, scattering dried leaves along the sidewalks. Sandra Philips stepped off the subway, her pace slow and weary. Her days felt endless, split between grueling shifts at the restaurant and restless nights in her small apartment. But tonight, something felt off. A growing discomfort tightened in her belly, and the baby seemed unusually restless. When she arrived home, she collapsed onto the couch, trying to ignore the waves of pain that came and went. It was too soon for the baby to arrive. She still had almost 2 months to go, yet a deep instinct told her something wasn't right. Across the city, Daniel Livinus was in the middle of a business meeting, but his thoughts were on Sandra. Since their last conversation, a sense of restlessness had taken hold of him, as if every decision he made was wrong. He wasn't a man who liked to fail, and the realization that he might have destroyed the only relationship that truly mattered gnawed at him. In the middle of the meeting, his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance at the screen. It was an unknown number. Against his usual habits, he picked it up. "Mr. Livinus?" A woman's voice sounded urgent. "This is Jenna, Sandra's neighbor. She's unwell and refusing to call an ambulance." I didn't know who else to call. Daniel shot to his feet, cutting off the meeting without explanation. He sprinted out of the building, calling for his driver to get him to Sandra's address as quickly as possible. When Daniel arrived, Sandra was slumped on the couch, pale and struggling to breathe evenly. James, her neighbor, was by her side, trying to convince her to go to the hospital. "Sandra," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with concern. "You don't have a choice. We're going to the hospital now." She tried to protest, but another sharp wave of pain silenced her. Daniel didn't wait. He scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the car. James hesitated, but Daniel shot him a look that left no room for argument. During the drive to the hospital, Sandra was visibly panicking. "It's too soon, Daniel," she said, gripping his arm tightly. "What if something's wrong?" "Nothing's going to happen," he said, though his own heart was pounding. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Those words seemed to calm her, and she leaned back against the seat, finally letting herself rest. Hours later, Sandra was rushed into the delivery room. Daniel stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement he didn't even know he was capable of. He saw the pain and effort in her eyes, and something inside him cracked. A wall he had spent years building. Finally, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room, and Sandra broke into tears of relief. The doctor announced it was a boy, healthy despite being born prematurely. Daniel looked at the tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket and felt an overwhelming surge of emotions he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. When they placed the baby in Sandra's arms, she gazed at him with a love so pure that Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He moved closer, looking at the baby for the first time. "He has your eyes," Sandra said softly. Daniel smiled for the first time in months. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift. Daniel was determined to be part of Sandra and the baby's life, not as the man he had been, but as someone better. He started restructuring his life, delegating more responsibilities at work so he could spend time with them. He drove Sandra to her medical appointments, brought her anything she needed for the baby, and even learned how to change diapers. Awkwardly at first, but with a focus that surprised them both. Sandra remained cautious. She saw Daniel's efforts, but she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. Still, she couldn't deny the changes she saw. He was more patient, more open, and for the first time, he seemed to truly listen. One sunny afternoon, they took their baby, now named Seth, to a park. While Sandra rested on a bench, Daniel held Seth in his arms, rocking him gently. He looked down at his son's tiny face and for the first time felt a sense of completeness. "Sandra," he said, turning to her, "I know I've made a lot of mistakes. You have every reason not to trust me, but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes, not just for Seth, but for you, because you two are all that matter to me now." Sandra was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Daniel and Seth. Finally, she spoke. "I believe in change, Daniel, but I can't promise anything. It's going to take time." He nodded, accepting her words as the start of something new. He knew earning back her trust wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be a father, a partner, and most importantly, human. That evening, as Sandra tucked Seth into bed, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them with a quiet smile. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The story ended as it had begun, but with one crucial difference. Daniel was no longer trying to control the world around him. He was learning how to truly be part of it.